The wind came like a warning, sharp, endless, and full of teeth. Esperanza Navarro hunched low behind a slab of crumbling adobe wall, clutching her skillet to her chest, like it could shield her from the sky. Her boots were shredded at the seams, the leather giving in to the same cracked earth she had walked for 4 days straight. Every breath came dry, pulling dust through her teeth and into her throat, leaving her coughing until her ribs ached. Her lips had split open yesterday. She hadn't spoken aloud in almost 2. The sun wasn't hot anymore. It was cruel. A white coin hammered above her head, not giving light, but peeling away anything soft. She dragged her body forward step by step through the dead bones of a town called Santa Perdita. No signs of life. Just sun-bleached wood, shattered glass, and the groaning of a sign swaying on a hinge like a tired soul hanging by a thread. Her right hand gripped the cast-iron skillet until her knuckles blanched. Her left pressed the deerskin pouch to her chest, close to her ribs, beneath what was left of her coat. She didn't have food, but she had cumin, oregano, a few grains of smoked chili, a single bay leaf tucked into the corner like a secret. The skillet was for surviving. The pouch was for living. She needed water, and fire, and 5 minutes of air that didn't scrape the inside of her chest. Her knees gave out near what used to be a general store. A shadow cut across her, but it was only the gallows in the center of town, its rope still swinging, as if remembering someone who had once waited too long. There was a well behind the gallows. She crawled to it on all 4s. The bucket was gone. The rope frayed to near nothing. She tied the tin cup from her belt to a shoelace and lowered it down until she heard a dull splash. When she hauled it up, the water was barely enough to wet her lips. It tasted of metal and rot, but she drank every drop. Her stomach curled, grateful and insulted all at once. She staggered toward a patch of collapsed porch, splintered timber jutting like broken ribs, dry enough to burn. She gathered what she could, stacking the kindling with trembling hands. She struck a match from her tin box, one of only 5 left, shielded it with her palms until it licked the wood. The fire bloomed weak and blue, but it caught. With effort, she set her skillet on top and pulled open the pouch. The scent that rose was more than spice. It was memory. It was her mother's kitchen back in the hills above Las Palomas, where tamales steamed on winter mornings and laughter hummed like lullabies. For a moment she could hear her mama's voice again. She poured the last of her dry pinto beans into the skillet, added water from her tin, pinched salt, cumin, chili powder, stirred with the same spoon her mother had carved from mesquite wood. The wind kicked dust around her legs, but the fire held. The beans hissed. The smell began to stretch into the corners of the dead town like something sacred. She ate slowly, making each bite last. They didn't fill her, but they silenced the gnawing ache enough to sit up straight again. When she finished, she scrubbed the skillet with sand and spit her motions slow and ritualistic. Her breath was steadier now. Her heart still ached, but not from fear, only from being human. A shadow passed over her fire. She gripped the skillet tight, ready to swing. The man who stood there didn't flinch. He was old hat, pulled low coat, patched with dust and age. His skin was dark and creased like canyon rock, a deep map of sun and time. His eyes weren't wild, just tired and empty of threat. "That's a smell I haven't known in 20 years, he said. Esme said nothing. Her voice wasn't ready, her trust even less so. The man knelt with a grunt, keeping his hands visible. "Not just beans," he said softly. "That's a kitchen. Big difference." She blinked. He motioned toward the pouch tucked beside her leg. "Spices like that don't come cheap. Or easy. Someone taught you right." He took off his hat and placed it beside him. "Name's Aurelio. Folks used to call me Tio back when anyone gave a damn." Still, she said nothing. Aurelio smiled with one side of his mouth. "I ain't gonna take from you. But if you've got one spoonful left, I can trade." He reached into his pocket and offered a piece of jerky wrapped in cloth. She looked at it, looked at him. "Keep your jerky," she rasped, voice dry as pine bark. "Food's meant to be shared." Aurelio accepted the spoonful like it was a blessing. He ate slow, eyes on the horizon. When he finished, he handed her the tin plate back with reverence. "My wife made beans like that. Back before the fever took her. Made a man feel like he had a home even if it was just dirt and fire." He looked at her differently now. "You don't belong in a place like this. This here's where things end. But you're more like beginnings." She scoffed once, harsh and hollow. "Beginnings are for people who haven't lost everything." He studied her for a moment, then nodded toward the north. "There's a place, 2 days from here. Sombra Valley. Biggest ranch in this stretch of New Mexico territory. Place as hard as the ground it stands on, but it eats better than most towns. It's run by a man named Mateo Salazar." The name fell heavy between them. Aurelio leaned in. "They call him El Hierro, the Iron. Man doesn't smile, doesn't forget, doesn't forgive. But he respects value. And he's got men 10, maybe more, working sun up to sundown, living off dry bread and beef, tougher than boot leather." Esme glanced at the skillet. "You think a man like that will take in a stranger because she can cook?" Aurelio gave a low whistle. "Not for the stranger. For what she can do to a man's memory. For what a real meal can awaken in people who've forgotten they were human." She didn't answer, but the fire was dying now, and the wind was changing. Aurelio reached into his coat, pulled out a bundle wrapped in waxed cloth, and tucked it beside her pack. "If you make it," he said, "give that to the cook, or whoever's left pretending to be one." He stood creaking in his joints. "I'm heading halfway there come morning. Can walk with you to the turn. But after that, it's all yours." Esme stared into the ashes, listened to the rustle of his boots as he walked off a few steps. She looked down at her hands, cracked, blistered, but steady. Then she picked up the pouch and held it to her chest. It still smelled like her mother's kitchen, but beneath it just barely something new had begun to stir. Not hope, not yet, but something harder. Purpose. A woman who can make the dead remember their kitchens doesn't belong in a place built for endings. Tio Aurelio's words rolled in Esme's mind as the sun crawled higher over the rim of the desert. The air was still sharp from the night, but heat already coiled low in the sand, ready to rise and punish anything that dared to move slowly. They walked side by side, not speaking much. Conversation wasn't something the desert had room for, it had to be carved out like water. Esme kept her pouch tight to her chest. Every footstep measured, every breath a dry scrape. She didn't ask for more than directions, and Aurelio didn't offer more than he thought she could carry. Still, there were things that passed between them in silence. The way he waited when her pace faltered. The way he glanced sideways when the wind picked up too hard, ready to shield her if it turned cruel. They passed old mesquite trees curled into themselves like forgotten prayers. Bones of a cattle carcass, long stripped, a stretch of fence posts that led nowhere. Esme caught a flicker of blue cloth tangled in one of them, someone else's story left unfinished. "Long road ahead," Aurelio said, voice low. "Sombra Valley ain't close, and it sure as hell ain't kind. But there's something there. Something alive." She didn't answer, just nodded and kept her stride. You got that kind of stillness in you. He went on the kind that makes folks nervous 'cause they can't read what's behind it. But I see it. What do you see? He pointed at the skillet strapped to her pack. That. I see fire that never died out. They stopped at a dry creek bed by midday, taking shelter under the ragged shadow of a cottonwood stump. Esme soaked a kerchief and laid it across her neck. Aurelio pulled jerky from his coat and broke off a piece for her. She chewed without tasting the salt, drawing out thirst faster than she could bear. Mateo Salazar, he said, after a stretch of silence. They say he doesn't speak more than he has to, that he walks the fence lines alone before dawn, doesn't waste bullets, words, or time. Sounds like a man who's been burned. He has, but he never stopped building. Esme leaned back, feeling the tiredness in her legs pressed deep into the marrow. You ever meet him? Aurelio rubbed a thumb over the edge of his belt buckle. Once, years ago. My brother worked for him. Got sick one winter, lungs full of dust and cold. Mateo gave him work indoors till spring. Didn't say why. Didn't ask anything back. Just gave the man a chance to die warm. Esme frowned. That doesn't sound like a tyrant. No, Aurelio said. But tyrants ain't always loud. Sometimes they just go quiet when kindness costs too much. They moved on when the light shifted. The shadows grew long, stretching behind them like history. The path narrowed into hard, ridged land, wind-cut stone, and low-lying scrub. Buzzards circled far above, barely moving as if conserving judgment. Esme's breath grew shallow. Her legs felt like she was walking on borrowed bones, but she didn't stop. Not once. Near sunset, they reached a split in the road. The western trail curved back toward the hills, where clouds hung over what might be a small settlement. The eastern path climbed toward a mesa ridge, cutting straight into the distance like a scar. Aurelio stopped. He tapped his cane against a weathered rock as if to mark it. This is where I turn off. You keep heading that way. He pointed up the path. Follow the ridge till it breaks into pasture. You'll see the gates before you see the people. Esme shaded her eyes with her hand, though there was little light left to fight. She stared toward the edge of land, where the sky turned deeper than blood. And if he says no, she asked. Aurelio exhaled slowly, then pulled something from his coat. A small oilskin pouch, tightly wrapped and knotted with cord. If you make it inside, give this to whoever's cooking, if there is such a soul. If not, open it yourself. Only when you need to remind someone what home used to taste like. She took the bundle without question. Its weight was small, but it felt full of something sacred. Aurelio's voice lowered more like a prayer than advice. Don't try to melt his heart. Feed it. She nodded once. It was all she could offer. As he turned to leave, he paused. You ask me why I helped you. She hadn't. I saw your fire, girl, not in your skillet, in your face when you poured those beans like they meant something. A woman who can make the dead remember their kitchens doesn't belong in a place built for endings. He tipped his hat, then disappeared down the western bend, his figure folding into the scrub and shadow until even the dust forgot him. Esme stood there a moment longer alone again. But not empty. The eastern path waited. She adjusted her pack, touched the pouch at her chest, and stepped forward. The road narrowed as she climbed. The light faded to the kind of dark that belonged to coyotes and things best left alone. But Esme didn't look back. Each step pulled her farther from what had nearly swallowed her and closer to the place where someone might finally see the fire she carried. She didn't know Mateo Salazar, didn't know his ghosts, his rules, or his rage. But she knew this: if the man had even half the hunger she'd seen in the bones of that dead town, then he'd understand what her cooking could offer. Not charity, not comfort, something older than both. She walked until her legs gave out, and even then she crawled to a hollow beneath the rock ledge and curled with the skillet beside her. The stars blinked down like scattered seeds, and the sky whispered things she couldn't quite understand. But one thought burned clear as ember in her mind. She was done being forgotten. And somewhere past this darkness, the most feared man in Sombra Valley was going to taste something he hadn't remembered in years. Something that might just remind him what it meant to be alive. The gate was closed, and so was the man waiting behind it. By late afternoon, the land had shifted beneath Esme's boots. What was once fractured earth and twisted brush had given way to order fences in straight lines, fields combed by labor water, pulled by hands who knew the worth of it. There was green here, not lush, but defiant. She could smell horse sweat on the breeze manure, smoke something faintly metallic, like blood and iron and pride. She stopped where the dirt path widened into a proper road, rutted by wagon wheels edged by scrub worn short from hooves. Up ahead, the gate rose from the land like a warning black iron tall, the tips spiked and sun-bleached at the edges. A heavy arch straddled the posts carved deep in Spanish Rancho Salazar. The only thing moving beyond the gate was a thin curl of smoke from the forge and a distant glint of sunlight off a glass window pane. The buildings looked solid adobe walls, dark wood beams, no sagging porches or wind-battered roofs. This place wasn't survival. It was control. Esme hesitated 1 foot just shy of the shadow cast by the gate. She could feel the weight of it already pressing against her chest, tighter than the strap of her pack. When no one came, she cleared her throat. "I'm here to speak to the rancher," she called. Her voice cracked like dry bark. Mateo Salazar. Silence. Then hoofbeats. A rider appeared from behind the corral, moving at a slow, skeptical pace. He was young, no older than 20, with sharp shoulders and a rifle tied to his saddle horn. His horse twitched beneath him, sensing Esme's presence with more interest than its rider. The young man stopped just inside the gate, leaned forward in his saddle, and looked her over with the air of someone evaluating a stray dog. "What do you want?" he asked. Esme kept her chin high. "Work. I'm a cook." He smirked, like that was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. "We don't take in drifters." "I'm not a drifter," she said. "I'm a cook." He glanced at the skillet strapped to her side, then at the cloth pouch she pressed against her ribs. He didn't laugh again, but he didn't move either. "Wait here," he muttered. He turned his horse and rode off toward the main house, a wide 2-story structure perched at the center of the ranch, like a general overseeing his troops. The shutters were closed, the porch bare, but something about its posture made it feel alive. Esme stood under the gate's shadow, sweat curling behind her neck, her boots rooted in dust. She could feel eyes on her watching from the bunkhouse behind stable doors, from shaded windows. No one spoke. Minutes dragged. The wind picked up, tugging her coat. She shifted her weight. The skillet clinked gently against her hip. Then the porch door opened. The man who stepped out moved with the gravity of someone who never hurried, because the world waited for him. Tall, broad-shouldered, plain dark shirt, worn pants, boots polished by dust and time. No silver, no badge, no ornament. Just authority that came from the way the ground seemed to brace itself beneath his steps. Mateo Salazar. He walked all the way to the gate, stopped 3 feet from it. The heat shimmered between them. His face looked carved, not aged hard lines, strong brow jaw clenched like a jaw that had forgotten how to loosen. His skin was weathered bronze, his dark hair pulled back with streaks of iron gray. His eyes were the color of a storm sky, not the flash of lightning, but the weight of clouds that never moved. He didn't speak right away. He looked her over piece by piece, boots, pants, torn sleeves, the sunburn on her cheek, the skillet, the pouch. Not with disgust, not even with judgment, just calculation. Then he spoke. "We give nothing away here." The words landed like cold steel across her throat. Esme's hands tightened around the pouch. She opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. Her tongue felt like a stone in her mouth. Her throat burned from the road, from fear, from memories of being turned away too many times to count. Mateo shifted, like he was already done, like he would turn and leave and forget she ever stood there. And something inside her snapped. Not rage, not desperation, conviction. "I'm not asking for a gift," she said, her voice low but clear. "I know I'm not worth much." Mateo stilled. She met his eyes now. She forced herself to look into the storm. "But I can cook." The words weren't impressive. They weren't rehearsed. But they were the only truth she had left. For the first time, his eyes focused, not on her rags, not on her skillet, on her face. He didn't speak, didn't move, just stared at her long enough for her pulse to pound against her ears. Then finally a nod, barely perceptible, a judgment made and passed. He turned slightly and addressed the young man still holding the reins nearby. "Show her the cookhouse." Then he looked back at her. "The men eat when the sun touches the western ridge. There are 10 of them. Cook for them." He walked away before she could speak again. The young ranch hand opened the gate with one foot in the stirrup and a sideways glance that held no malice, only disbelief. "This way," he said. Esme stepped through the gate. It clanged shut behind her with a metallic finality that echoed through her chest. She had entered, but not been accepted. The ranch yard smelled of horses and ash and wood. Dogs barked in the distance. Someone pounded metal behind the forge. A windmill creaked above the barn. The young man dismounted in front of a long, narrow adobe building with shuttered windows and a single iron chimney. He shoved open the door. Stoves in there. Pantry on the right. Water pump out back. He looked her over once more. "Name's Leo." She nodded but said nothing. He hesitated. "The boss wasn't joking," he added. "Sun hits that ridge, they'll be expecting food." Then he left her alone in the doorway. The cookhouse smelled like dust and old grease. The stove was big, blackened, and cold. Cabinets lined the walls. The floor was worn brick. It wasn't a kitchen. Not yet. Esme stepped inside, closed the door, and leaned against it for one breath. Just one. Then she walked across the room, unfastened her skillet, and laid it on the counter. The sound echoed like the first word of a new language. She would cook, and they would eat. And what happened next would belong to what she made with her hands. Not what the world thought she was. "I can't give you comfort," she whispered to the pot, "but I can give you something honest." Esme stood in the cookhouse alone. The door had shut behind her with the sound of something final, and the silence that followed was thick enough to touch. The windows were shuttered, filtering the light into slatted lines across the scarred floor. Dust floated in the air like ash from a long-dead fire. She stared at the stove. It loomed like a challenge, blackened with years of smoke and neglect. The iron mouth hung open, full of old ash and charred wood, cold as bone. She dropped her pack by the counter and knelt in front of it. Her hands worked fast on instinct. Ash scraped out into a dented tin bucket, kindling from the stack beside the pantry, a match from her dwindling supply. The flame caught slowly shy at first, then bolder. She fed it until the stove came alive, the metal popping and shifting as it remembered heat. When the warmth reached her face, she let herself breathe deeper, just once. She opened the pantry next. It was as promised, functional, nothing fresh. Sacks of flour, salt, pork, dry beans, yellow onions with the tops curling brown and brittle. Lard in a dented tin. Slabs of salted beef. Nothing soft, nothing forgiving, but everything usable. She selected what she needed and laid it on the counter, setting her skillet beside them with a steady thud. The familiar weight of it grounded her. She filled a dented bucket with water from the pump out back. Cold, clean. That was something. The beef was dry and stiff to the touch. She cut it into rough cubes with the paring knife she'd carried since Las Palomas. The blade was small but sharp. The onions made her eyes sting. She welcomed it. It made her feel present, awake. She moved quickly, efficiently. Rendered the lard in the skillet until it shimmered. Browned the beef in batches. The meat hissed and sizzled, and the smell rose thick and meaty, filling the cookhouse like a promise. Next, the onions. She tossed them in the fat and stirred until they turned golden and soft, nearly sweet. Then came the spices, her mother's pouch in her hand, the cloth warm from her body. Cumin, chili, oregano. She pinched each between her fingers and dropped it into the skillet. The scent bloomed instantly, stronger than smoke, louder than silence. It spread like memory. She toasted the spices in the onion fat just until the edges darkened, just until the air changed. Then she scraped everything into the stock pot, poured water over it, and added potatoes, scrubbed, chopped, unpeeled. One bay leaf torn, just slightly dropped in like a quiet benediction. The lid went on. The fire was turned low. Now it needed time. Esme wiped her hands on a rag and looked around the cookhouse. The tables were long scarred by knives and years. The shelves were in decent order. She could work with this. She'd made do with worse. She moved to the counter and began mixing flour, salt, and water for biscuits. No time for yeast. Just quick bread, simple, humble enough to soak up the stew. She worked the dough until it came together, then cut the rounds and placed them on an iron tray. By the time the sun reached the western ridge, turning the sky behind it, gold and fire orange, the stew had thickened into something rich and steady. The biscuits were browned, their scent buttery and warm. She had just finished setting 10 tin plates on the long table when the door creaked open. The men filed in one by one, dusty, sun-baked, and silent. Their boots thudded heavy on the floorboards, hats low over their eyes. They didn't speak to her or to each other. They moved like men used to routine, used to silence, used to disappointment. Esme didn't say a word. She picked up the ladle and filled each plate with stew meat potatoes, broth spiced with something deeper than heat. She placed a biscuit beside each serving, watching as calloused hands reached without ceremony. No one blessed the food. No one gave thanks. They just ate. And then something strange happened. No one talked, but no one left either. Spoons scraped the bottom of plates slowly. A man with a gray streak through his beard closed his eyes after a bite. Another cleaned his biscuit through the last of the broth like it meant something. She stood behind the counter, still as a post, watching. Not a single plate was left unfinished. When they were done, a few of them took their plates to the wash basin and left them there without being asked. A kind of silent offering. They left the way they came, in a line, boots heavy, without a word. But the silence was different now. It wasn't cold. It was full. The cookhouse door stayed open a while longer. The last man to leave was tall, raw-boned, with a stiff limp and a faded bandana tied tight at his throat. He paused in the doorway, glanced back at the empty pot on the stove, then looked at her just a flicker of a look, and gave a single, almost invisible nod. Then he was gone. Esme stood still for a long time. Her hands ached, her back throbbed, her throat was tight from holding her breath through every bite they took. But she had done it. She hadn't made anything fancy. She'd made something true. The door creaked again. Mateo Salazar entered without announcement. He crossed the floor with the same deliberate calm as before. No words, just presence. His eyes scanned the room. The clean plates, the empty pot, the cooling stove. He stepped forward, filled a plate from the pot's bottom, sat at the head of the long table, and began to eat. He didn't rush, didn't speak, just ate. Esme watched from behind the counter, every muscle locked. When he finished, he set the spoon down on the plate. Clean. He looked up. "Who have you cooked for?" before Esme swallowed. "My mother," she said softly. "And myself." He stared at her a moment longer, then gave a single nod. Not approval, not kindness, recognition. He turned to the doorway. "Give her the small room behind the storeroom," he said to someone unseen. "A blanket, a lamp." Then he walked out, boots heavy on the floor. Esme stood where she was, the warmth of the stove fading. She wasn't welcomed. She wasn't hired. But she was still standing. And that meant something. From outside, the steps of a young man approached. Leo. He waited, not speaking, until she followed him. The cookhouse door shut behind them, but the scent of spice and broth lingered in the wood. And somewhere deep in the stone bones of this ranch, something had begun to stir. No one welcomed her, but the door closed, and that was enough. The room Leo led her to was narrow, dim, and smelled of dried tobacco and sun-warmed adobe. A single cot hugged the far wall, the thin mattress bowed in the center, like it remembered someone long gone. The walls were bare, the air still. There was no window, just a lantern on a nail and a folded wool blanket laid on the cot like it hadn't been touched in years. Leo didn't say much. He nodded toward the small table with a chipped enamel basin on top. "Water's out back," he said. Then after a beat, "You cook like someone who knows how to listen." She didn't know what to say to that, so she nodded once. He left without another word. Esme set her skillet down gently on the table and leaned the spice pouch against the edge as if the room wouldn't feel right until it had a heartbeat. She sat on the cot. It creaked beneath her, stiff and uncertain. The muscles in her legs throbbed from standing all day. Her palms burned where the heat from the stove had licked through cloth. Her lower back ached from bending, lifting, stirring. But none of it mattered. The pain was a kind of music. It meant she was still part of something living. She lit the lantern, watching the room take on shadows instead of light. The flame flickered against the walls, dancing like it wasn't sure if it belonged here either. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was a question. She lay down on the cot, pulling the blanket over her shoulders. It was rough, smelled like cedar and storage. Her eyes burned, not from smoke this time, but from a weight behind them she wasn't ready to name. She didn't cry. Crying was something people with safety did. Instead, she stared at the ceiling until the oil in the lantern burned low, the light going soft, then gray, then gone. That night, she dreamed of her mother's hands stirring a pot. The rhythm was steady, the scent of cumin thick in the air. But when she looked up, her mother had no face, just a shape made of smoke. And Esme stood at the edge of a fire that flickered like it knew too many secrets. She woke with a jolt before dawn, heart pounding, mouth dry. The room was still. The world outside still slept, but the ranch would wake soon. She moved like a whisper, splashing water on her face from the basin, combing her fingers, through her tangled hair, tightening the braid she'd slept on. The morning air outside bit into her skin like a warning. Stars still glinted in the pale blue overhead. She could see her breath. She crossed the yard quickly, every footstep stirring dust. The cookhouse door groaned when she opened it, the smell of yesterday's work still lingering in the walls. She built the fire again, from scratch kindling breath-match flame. The stove sighed as it woke metal, ticking and shifting in protest. She filled the pot with water and started another batch of biscuits, hands moving with more confidence now. Her body remembered even when her mind was slow. She worked until the sky turned gold and the sounds of the ranch began: hooves, voices, buckets, clanging boots on dirt. The men came in silent again, hats, low shoulders, heavy. She fed them without words, and they ate. Same as before. But something had changed. A few of them looked at her now, not long, not hard, but enough to see her as a person and not just hands. One murmured thanks. Another stacked his plate and cup before he left. Small things, but they landed like pebbles in still water. After they were gone, Esme scrubbed the cookware and swept the floor. She opened a few cabinets, took stock of what she had. Salt pork would last maybe another week. The onions were sprouting. The flour was enough for 3, maybe 4 days. She'd need to make it stretch. She opened the spice pouch carefully. The scent rose soft and warm, familiar as breath. She took inventory there too. Chili powder was low, only 2 bay leaves left. She folded it shut again gently, like she was tucking in a child. Her fingers brushed something beneath the table, a small scrap of cloth, rough and faded. She tugged it free. A dish towel, stained and clean. Someone had folded it with care and tucked it beneath the table leg to stop it from rocking. She smiled without meaning to. Someone had tried to make the space livable, even if just a little. By late afternoon, she was preparing to make a batch of thick corn cakes to serve with black bean stew when she noticed it. A sprig of green on the cookhouse step. She blinked, walked closer. It was wild oregano, fresh, still damp with dew. She crouched to pick it up, held it close to her nose. Sharp, clean, alive. Someone had left it there. Not dropped. Placed. She turned slowly, scanning the yard, but saw no one. Only movement near the horse trough, someone brushing down a bay gelding. A man with broad shoulders moving slow and deliberate. Tomas. She didn't call out. Didn't ask. She didn't need to. That night she crushed the oregano between her fingers and rubbed it into the salt pork before she cooked it. The smell changed, immediately went deeper, richer, more awake. The vaqueros noticed. They didn't say a word, but she saw it in the way they sat straighter. In the way one man paused with the spoon halfway to his mouth, eyes narrowed like memory had caught him off guard. Esme didn't look at Tomas as she served, but when he took his first bite, he looked at her. Not long, not hard, just enough. The moment passed, but something had rooted, and deep in Esme's chest, she felt it settle like the first seed in spring soil, uncertain, small, but waiting for the right light. He didn't speak, but he fed her the way she fed everyone else. Every morning before the sky bled from blue to gold, Esme rose from her cot and stepped out into the hush of Sombra Valley. The cold bit the edge of her breath, and her boots found the same groove in the dirt path as if it had already memorized her steps. She built the fire without thinking now. Her hands worked with the quiet confidence of ritual ash swept out, kindling laid, match struck. The stove responded like it had been waiting for her. The cookhouse warmed slowly, exhaling heat into the brick floor and cracked walls like a beast coming to life. She had no clock, but the sky and the distant clang of the forge, the creak of leather from the barn, and the sound of the first boots hitting packed dirt. She didn't need more. One morning, as she opened the cookhouse door to fetch water from the pump, her foot stopped short. Another gift. A small handful of piñon nuts carefully placed in a folded scrap of cloth, tied with twine. No name. She stared at it, heart-steady thoughts racing. Her fingers touched the cloth. It was clean, soft from wear. She untied the knot and lifted the edge. The scent of pine and warm earth drifted upward. She looked toward the barn. Tomas was hauling a saddle over one shoulder, walking alongside the corral with his usual quiet presence. He didn't glance her way. She smiled softly to herself, tucked the gift into her apron pocket, and returned to the stove. The nuts roasted in a pan, their oils warming the room, and she added them to a pot of ground cornmeal and onion broth, making a porridge rich and nutty, unfamiliar but filling. She saw one of the ranch hands pause with his spoon halfway to his mouth, then nod once to no one in particular before finishing the bowl. Each morning after that, something new waited on the step. Wild onions, a tiny bundle of fresh sage, a single mushroom, perfect and round, wrapped in a piece of paper from an old Spanish prayer book. She never asked. He never told. But she started saving him a portion before the rest of the men arrived, setting it to the side in a tin bowl near the back counter. And every night when she returned to clean up, the bowl was empty, washed, and set precisely where she'd left it. They never spoke. Not once. But they understood. She began seeing him more clearly, not just the silent man with slow steps and downcast eyes, but the way he moved with horses, how they trusted him. Even the wild ones. He calmed them with just his presence. No jerks or shouts. Just steadiness. She knew that language. One afternoon, she stepped outside to shake out a flour sack and caught sight of Tomas leaning against the trough, his left hand clutched in his right. Blood darkened the rag wrapped around it. Without a word, she walked to him. He looked up, startled. "Let me see," she said, her voice soft but firm. He hesitated. "Please." He loosened the cloth and she winced. The cut was deep, fresh, running from the base of his thumb across his palm. A rope burn at the edge told the story, spooked colt, hard pull, too much weight. She ran back to the cookhouse and returned with warm water, salt, clean rags. She said nothing as she knelt beside him on the trough ledge and dipped his hand into the basin. He flinched as the salt bit the wound, but he didn't pull away. She cleaned the gash gently, wiping away blood and grit. Then she tore a strip from a feed sack, folded it twice, and wrapped his palm carefully. Her fingers were quick, deliberate. When she finished, she looked up. Tomas held her gaze. There was no smile, no nod, but something passed between them, a quiet affirmation. She stood and wiped her hands on her apron. "You've been feeding me for a week now," she said. "Seems fair I return the favor." He almost smiled. That evening, she added wild sage to the bean stew and crushed piñon nuts into the biscuit dough. The men didn't comment, but their bowls came back cleaner than ever. Even Raúl Ortega, who never looked at her longer than necessary, left a full biscuit crust, wiped spotless. Later, when the fire was dying and the cookhouse had gone still, she found a tiny carving sitting on the step outside. A chili pepper. Carved from mesquite wood, the stem curled just so, small enough to fit in her palm. She turned it over in her hands, smiling. The next morning, she placed it on the shelf above her spice pouch, right between the coffee tin and the worn salt box. She didn't tell anyone. She didn't have to. The men continued to come in silent lines, their hats tugged low, their shoulders stiff from long rides and harder labor. But something in the air was different now. The way they lingered after a meal. The way one of them, an older vaquero with a white streak through his beard, tipped his hat to her when he left. Not showy, just enough to be noticed. Esme felt it like a slow thaw, a warmth that came not from fire but from recognition. They weren't speaking to her yet, but they were listening. The meals told them everything they needed to know. She cooked like someone who remembered what home was, even if she'd lost her own. And every mouthful reminded them too, even if they couldn't say it. Even Mateo had changed in his way. He still ate in silence, still cleaned his plate without comment. But he now arrived at the cookhouse at the end of the line, not the beginning. He waited. He watched. And though he never praised her, never softened, he had not once questioned her right to stay. Esme knew that was its own kind of approval. She didn't expect more. Still, she felt it. Something shifting under the surface of this land, of these men, of herself. And it began with the language that needed no words. A sprig of sage, a carved chili, a bowl returned empty but clean, and a man who never spoke but understood the meaning of being fed. If Al-Mudina smells that kitchen, she'll come running with teeth. Bay Rivera's words had followed Esme all morning, winding around her thoughts like smoke. She had seen the older woman only twice since that first meeting, once when she had brought Esme a bundle of herbs, another time when she had made a point to pass by the cookhouse and check on her progress. Bee's smile was rare, but it always reached her eyes, glimmering with knowing. Esme had thought little of Bee's warning at first, but now standing in the cookhouse before the stove, she couldn't shake the feeling that the woman had been right. The air outside had gone thick with the scent of rain, the clouds hanging low over the valley like a promise. The men had already finished their morning meal, their boots heavy on the wood plank floors, as they headed out to the fields or the barn, disappearing into the fading fog. Esme had cleaned the last of the dishes, hung the pots back on their hooks, and finally stepped outside to breathe. The cool air felt like a salve on her skin, the ground beneath her feet soft from the earlier mist. She walked toward the back of the ranch near the barn where the horses were kept, when she saw Bee coming toward her, walking with purpose, her long skirt swishing against the dirt. Esme's stomach tightened. She knew that look. Bee wasn't coming to chat about herbs or food. "Thought I'd find you here?" Bee said, her voice low and sharp eyes scanning the horizon, as if waiting for something or someone. Esme stepped forward to meet her. "What's wrong?" Bee didn't answer right away. She hesitated, her gaze flickering toward the cookhouse. "Mateo's aunt is coming today." Esme's heart gave a quick, sharp beat. Al-Mudina Bea nodded, lips pressed into a thin line. "She's been away for the past few weeks, but she's back now. Word travels faster than the wind around here." Esme felt the weight of it, the tension thickening around her like a storm cloud. She knew enough about Al-Mudina Salazar to know that a woman like that could make a room feel small with a single glance. And Esme wasn't sure she was ready to face that kind of scrutiny, especially from a woman who ruled with invisible hands. "She'll smell the kitchen," Bee added, "and she'll want to see who's cooking. She has a way of keeping things in line around here." You know, Esme looked toward the cookhouse where the door stood open, the faintest wisp of steam rising from the stove. "I don't know if I can handle her." Bee's expression softened, but only for a moment. "She's not the type to understand what you're doing here, Esme. Not like Mateo. But she'll respect the food. That much I can tell you." Esme nodded, unsure of herself. She had become accustomed to cooking in the silence, her food speaking louder than her words. But Al-Mudina was a different beast. Her presence would be louder than anything Esme had ever known. "I'll be here when she comes," Bee said, patting Esme's shoulder before turning to leave. "But remember, this place is as much about survival as it is about respect. And if she's the one you're up against, Well, you know how it works. Esme watched Bee walk away, the weight of her words sinking in. She turned back to the cookhouse, feeling the unease settle in her bones. She hadn't even unpacked fully, hadn't made herself comfortable. But there was no time to waste now. She returned to the stove, the fire low. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt so unsettled, so small. Her hands were steady as she prepped the meal for the men, but her mind kept returning to the idea of Al-Mudina, the woman who ran things here in ways that no one saw until they needed to. The door to the cookhouse opened with a creak. Esme didn't look up at first. She just kept working, chopping onions, stirring the pot, trying to drown out the thoughts swirling in her head. "Smells good in here," a voice said. Esme stiffened but didn't turn around. Bee had been right. Al-Mudina was here, and already she could feel the weight of her gaze. The woman stood just inside the door, her presence commanding. She was taller than Esme had imagined her figure, straight, her dark eyes narrowing as she took in the sight of the cookhouse and the food on the stove. Her lips curled ever so slightly, a smile that held no warmth, only an assessment. "You're the new cook," Al-Mudina said, her voice rich with authority, but not unkind. "Didn't expect someone like you to be serving in this kitchen." Esme swallowed, but kept her back straight. "I'm here to cook." Al-Mudina stepped closer, her eyes flicking over the shelves, the pots, and then to Esme herself. She was quiet for a long moment, her gaze piercing as though she was measuring every part of Esme's being. Then, without warning, Al-Mudina smiled. It was a slow, deliberate smile that hinted at something darker underneath. "You're feeding the men well, I see." She took a step forward, inspecting the simmering pot on the stove. "What's this?" Esme didn't flinch. "Black beans and pork stew with corn cakes." Al-Mudina's smile widened, and she leaned over the pot, inhaling deeply. "I see. Simple, but not without merit." She paused, and for a moment Esme thought she might say something else, something harsher, more cutting. But Al-Mudina only stood there silently judging before she finally nodded. "You'll do for now." Esme stood still, keeping her expression neutral. She wanted to ask what Al-Mudina truly thought, but she didn't have the words. Instead, she returned to the stove, turning the pot with a slow, measured motion. The kitchen felt smaller now, with Al-Mudina looming behind her. Without another word, Al-Mudina left the cookhouse, her steps deliberate. But just before the door closed, she glanced over her shoulder. "Remember," she said, her voice carrying through the small space. "In this house, food is never just food. It's power." The door clicked shut behind her, and Esme let out the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. For the first time since coming to the ranch, she felt the weight of being here more than ever. Al-Mudina's presence wasn't just a threat, it was a declaration. And Esme wasn't sure if she had the strength to stand up to it. But she would, because she had to. And as she returned to the stove, stirring the stew, she realized something. This wasn't just about feeding the men anymore. This was about proving that she belonged here, that she could make a place for herself even in the shadow of a woman like Al-Mudina. Her hands tightened on the ladle as the fire crackled behind her, and the door swung open once more, bringing with it the promise of another challenge to face. "That smell doesn't belong to you," the old woman said. "It belongs to the dead." Esme stood in the cookhouse, the iron skillet warm in her hands. The aroma of garlic and onions mingled with the smell of fresh-baked bread, but Al-Mudina's words hovered in the air, like smoke impossible to ignore. The door opened with a creak, and there she was, Al-Mudina Salazar, standing in the doorway, like she owned the entire ranch. Her dark eyes were sharp, and her gaze immediately went to the pot on the stove. Her lips twisted in something between a smile and a sneer. The subtle judgment in her eyes made Esme's chest tighten, but she didn't flinch. She had learned not to flinch, not here, not anymore. "I'm sorry," Esme said, forcing the words through the tightness in her throat. "But the recipe is my own. The spices are from my mother's pouch." She held her breath, hoping that Al-Mudina would leave it at that. Al-Mudina stepped into the cookhouse, her boots sounding loud on the wooden floor. She didn't seem to care about the food anymore. She was focused on Esme, studying her with the careful scrutiny of someone who had lived a lifetime with nothing but the rules she created. Al-Mudina moved toward the counter, her hand brushing against a tin cup, a ladle, the bowl of herbs Esme had set aside for the stew. "Your mother's pouch." Al-Mudina repeated softly, the words almost a taunt. "What does she know about food then? And what do you know? You think you can make something of this place? You think you're here to cook?" Esme's heart skipped a beat, the air feeling too thick to breathe. She hadn't expected, hadn't thought that Al-Mudina would come at her with anything less than cold indifference. But there was something else behind her eyes now. Something sharp, almost dangerous. Al-Mudina wasn't just testing her food. She was testing her. "I'm here to cook," Esme said again, her voice quiet but firm. "That's all." Al-Mudina's gaze flickered over her once more, lingering on the skillet, the wooden spoon in Esme's hand. And then, as if she had made a decision, she crossed her arms over her chest and leaned back against the counter, her expression unreadable. "You are new here," she said, voice colder now, as though she had finally settled into some measure of disdain. "You don't understand the way things work on this ranch. You think you can just cook and make it all better." She let out a soft, mocking laugh. "Food isn't just food here. It's power, it's control. You're playing a dangerous game." Esme swallowed, trying to ignore the knot that was tightening in her stomach. Her hands shook just slightly, but she refused to show any more weakness. "I'm not trying to play any game," Esme said. "I'm just trying to cook." Al-Mudina pushed herself off the counter and walked toward the door, stopping just before the threshold. "You'll learn, or you'll leave." Her voice was low, controlled. She didn't raise it, didn't need to. Every word came with the weight of authority. She paused for a moment before turning to face Esme once more. "Don't ever think you're better than this kitchen," Al-Mudina said, her voice hardening. "It's more than food. It's more than what you see. If you forget that, you'll never survive here." With that, she left the door slamming shut behind her, with a finality that seemed to rattle the cookhouse walls. Esme stood frozen, her breath shallow, her hands still gripping the ladle. The air around her seemed too tight, the silence too heavy. She had expected Al-Mudina to be cold, but this was something different. The woman didn't care about the food, about the meal, or about what Esme could offer. She cared about control. She cared about power. Esme felt a cold chill slide down her spine. She had thought that food cooking could be her way in. She had thought that if she fed the men well, if she showed them what she could do, with just the simplest of ingredients, she could carve a place for herself here. But Al-Mudina had made it clear that food wasn't enough. Not here. The stew still simmered on the stove, the thick scent of garlic and spice filling the air. Esme turned toward it, her fingers curling around the handle of the skillet, but she didn't move. She didn't need to finish it. Not for Al-Mudina, not for anyone else. But she would. The fire beneath the stove still crackled, the flames dancing in their own quiet rhythm. The kitchen had gone silent again, but Esme could still feel the weight of Al-Mudina's presence pressing down on her, even though the woman was gone. Esme breathed deeply, steadying herself. She had to keep going. If she stopped now, if she let Al-Mudina win, she'd have nothing. She would be just another name in the wind, a forgotten face among the many others who had come and gone before her. She set the ladle down and went back to the stove. There was more work to do, more food to prepare. The men would return for their evening meal soon. They'd expect something solid, something filling, something that tasted like home. She wasn't going to let Al-Mudina take that from her. She would feed them not just with the ingredients she had, but with what she had left of herself. And that she knew was something Al-Mudina could never control. The door opened again. Esme turned, expecting to see Al-Mudina or perhaps one of the men, but instead it was Tomas, his hands still wrapped in the same old bandages from days ago. He was standing at the threshold, watching her quietly, his dark eyes unblinking. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The room hummed with a kind of understanding that Esme couldn't quite place. Tomas stepped forward, reaching into his coat pocket. He pulled out another sprig of fresh herbs, this time rosemary. A small bundle wrapped tightly in cloth. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Esme's chest tightened with something she couldn't name, gratitude maybe, but also a strange kind of resolve, a feeling she hadn't known she was searching for. "Thank you," she whispered. Tomas nodded once and left without a word. Esme stood still for a moment, holding the rosemary, feeling the rough edges of the bundle between her fingers, and then she returned to the stove, adding the rosemary to the stew. Maybe she thought maybe food was more than power. Maybe it was the one thing they hadn't yet taken from her, and she was going to keep it that way. She stirred the pot, letting the rosemary settle in, letting the fragrance rise and mix with the rest. When the men came, they would know what she could do with what little she had. She would show them that food could be something more than power. It could be truth. Esme continued to work, her hands steady the fire beneath her, feeding the quiet fire inside her. The kitchen was her space, her fight, and she was done being afraid. "You don't just cook like her. You smell like healing." Esme stared down at the pot of stew, her fingers lightly gripping the ladle. The scent had shifted, deepened, layered like something both ancient and new. The fire beneath the stove crackled as she stirred, and for a moment she couldn't remember the last time she'd felt like she belonged somewhere. Not here, not in Sombra Valley, and certainly not with the men who ate in silence. But in the kitchen. Here in this tiny, suffocating room, something clicked into place. She had found her ground, or perhaps it had found her. It was a strange thing, she realized. Food wasn't just nourishment. Not here. Not for the men. They could have eaten anywhere, another ranch, another cook, but they didn't. They had chosen her, and it wasn't because of her skill. It was because she had offered something they didn't know they needed. A memory. A soft touch. A moment of something warm in a world too often cold. Her hands trembled slightly as she finished ladling out the stew into the waiting bowls, each one carefully placed on the counter. Her fingers brushed the edge of a small worn towel that had been folded neatly beside the sink. She paused, recognizing the familiar sight of the same kind of towel she had used in her mother's kitchen many miles and years away. The connection was fleeting, but enough to make her feel, if only for a second, like she had come home. The door creaked open behind her, and she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. She'd learned the sound of their boots, heavy but not careless. They came one by one, the vaqueros who had worked the land since sunrise, their faces weathered by the same sun that beat down on the ranch. But it wasn't just the men who had come for dinner. She heard him before she saw him, the slow, deliberate steps of Mateo Salazar, his presence filling the room before he even crossed the threshold. The door swung open, and there he was, just as silent, just as imposing as ever. His gaze swept over the meal, over the bowls that waited the small kitchen, now alive with the scent of warmth and care. Without a word, He stepped forward, his boots loud on the wood, and took his seat at the table. The other men did the same, moving in a rhythm as old as the land itself. They didn't talk, not yet. Not until they had eaten. Esme had come to understand that this too was part of the routine, the ritual that governed their lives, the rhythm of food. She served them without a second thought. One bowl after another, passing them down the line. Each man took what he needed, dipping the spoon into the stew with the same mechanical precision as if it were a dance they'd all memorized. Mateo waited until they were settled before he finally picked up his own bowl and stirred it slowly, his eyes lingering on the meal before he brought the spoon to his lips. Esme felt her throat tighten as she watched him. She couldn't quite place the emotion that stirred within her. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was pride. Or perhaps it was both. But then just as quickly something shifted. He took another spoonful and another. The silence in the room hung thick, but it wasn't oppressive. It was comfortable. Esme didn't know how to explain it. It wasn't like the quiet had to be filled with words. It was a quiet that said everything that needed to be said. When Mateo set his spoon down, there was a subtle shift. The other men, too, had finished. They weren't just done eating. They were done pretending. They looked at Esme. For a moment, she thought they might speak, but they didn't. Instead, they looked back at their empty bowls, then to Mateo, waiting for his judgment, his decision, the one who led them without speaking a word. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of silence, Mateo looked up at her. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and for a moment, Esme thought he might ask her to leave to remind her that she didn't belong, but he didn't. Instead, he nodded his jaw tight as if he had just come to a conclusion he hadn't expected. "You've done more than feed us?" Mateo said, his voice low but clear. It was the first time he had spoken to her directly in days. "You've given us something we forgot." Esme's chest tightened. She couldn't remember when she had last felt that kind of recognition. Not from a stranger, not from anyone. "Thank you," he added almost as an afterthought. But the words were enough. They landed between them like the weight of something important. The men stood as one, a synchrony that was both practiced and inevitable. Esme felt their gaze on her as they filed out of the cookhouse one by one. She was left alone with Mateo, who didn't move from his seat. He was still. She set the ladle down and took a slow breath, unsure of what to say or do next. She wasn't used to receiving thanks, especially not in this way. Not from someone who had so much more power than she could understand. After a long moment, Mateo pushed his chair back and stood up. His gaze lingered on her for a fraction longer than necessary. Then he turned and walked toward the door, pausing with his hand on the frame. "Keep feeding them," he said, without turning around. "And you might just find a place here." He stepped outside and the door clicked shut behind him. Esme stood still, her pulse racing. His words echoed in the room, a promise wrapped in a challenge. She wasn't sure what he meant. She wasn't sure if he meant anything at all, but somehow it didn't matter. What mattered was that she had done something. She had stepped into this world and for the first time had been seen for what she was capable of. Not just for what she cooked, but for what she could offer. As the sun sank lower in the sky, Esme remained in the cookhouse, the quiet now a companion rather than a burden. She looked at the small window where the light still lingered, turning the dust particles in the air into a soft glow. The land outside was vast, unending, but the world inside was hers for now, and that was enough. For the first time since she had arrived, Esme felt like she had taken a step forward. The feeling wasn't grand or loud. It was subtle, like the soft hum of a new day stirring just beneath the surface. But it was real. and it was the first step toward something more. She turned back to the counter, her hands already moving to clean up the dishes. There was still work to do. There would always be work to do. But now she understood that it wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about claiming a place for herself, one spoonful at a time. Her mother's handwriting trembled in her hands like it had been waiting. Esme sat at the small table in the cookhouse, the dim light of the lantern flickering softly. The wind had picked up, carrying the scent of rain on the horizon, but inside the air was thick with something else, something that pulled at her heart. She held the folded paper in her hands, the edges worn, the ink faint but still legible. Her mother's handwriting, curved and careful, filled the page. Esme hadn't expected to see it. The letter, the recipe, the link to the past. She hadn't expected it to come back to her like this, wrapped in the same cloth that had once held her mother's spices, buried beneath everything else in the small leather pouch. But there it was. A recipe. For tamales. The tamales her mother had made every year at Christmas, the ones that had tasted like home, like warmth and family and safety. The ones that had filled their house with laughter and love long before the world had gotten smaller and quieter. Her mother's handwriting seemed to pulse on the paper, as if trying to bring her back into the warmth of those days. Esme read it again, slowly. The instructions were simple, written in the language of home corn husks, masa pork, chili cumin, a pinch of something secret that only her mother had known how to add. It wasn't complicated, but it was perfect. She felt a pang in her chest as she folded the paper carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. She knew what this meant. It wasn't just food. It wasn't just about feeding people. It was about what food could bring, what it could restore, what it could heal. Her fingers traced the edges of the paper one last time. Then she looked up at the stove, the pot of beans still simmering in the background. She had everything she needed. Everything but one thing: faith. Faith that she could still bring it all back. That she could still make something that would remind the men of who they were before the land had hardened their hearts. But now, with the tamale recipe in her hands, something in her shifted. Maybe it wasn't just the food. Maybe it was what the food carried with it. The stories, the memories, the lessons. Maybe it was time to make them all feel alive again. She stood moving to the shelves to pull down the masa, the pork she'd saved, the dried chili she had been holding on to. The work ahead was more than cooking. It was a reminder of why she was here. A reminder of what she had to offer. The door opened behind her, creaking on its hinges. She didn't turn around immediately. The men came and went at different hours now, in and out of the kitchen, without much ceremony. It was just how things were. But when she heard the footsteps stop, she glanced up. Mateo stood in the doorway, framed by the fading light from outside, his dark eyes catching the last slivers of sunlight as they dipped beneath the horizon. He hadn't come for food this time. He hadn't come for anything really other than to watch. "I've never seen anyone cook like that before," he said quietly, his voice as deep as the valley itself. Esme paused, her hands still wrapped around the wooden spoon she'd been stirring with. She wasn't sure what to say. There were too many things to say, too many thoughts rattling around in her head. She wanted to ask him what he thought, what he expected, what he wanted from her. But she didn't. Instead, she said, "It's my mother's recipe. She taught me when I was young." Mateo didn't move, didn't step into the room. He just stood there watching her, his gaze steady, almost unreadable. "You learned well," he said after a long moment. "It's not just the cooking. It's something else. Something deeper." Esme met his eyes, trying to read the weight behind his words. She didn't know what he meant. She didn't know if she even cared. All she knew was that the kitchen had become a place of healing for her, a place to reconnect with the person she used to be, the person she still wanted to be. But she didn't know how to explain that to him. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded, his eyes flicking down to the table where she had left the tamale recipe. Then, almost as if he hadn't even meant to, he stepped forward. His boots barely made a sound on the wooden floor. He reached the table and picked up the paper she had placed there earlier, scanning it with the same careful intensity he used when inspecting the ranch. "This is a recipe you've kept with you," he said. "It's more than just food, isn't it?" Esme nodded, her throat tight. "Yes." Mateo folded the paper carefully and placed it back on the table. His fingers lingered over the creased edges for a moment before he turned to leave. "You should make those tamales," he said quietly, his back to her. "It's time." Esme stood there watching him leave, the weight of his words settling like dust around her. She didn't fully understand what he meant, but something inside her felt the truth in it. She turned back to the stove and began working the masa, her hands moving with a steady rhythm she hadn't felt in years. She wrapped the pork and chili and the corn husks, pressing the tamales together with care, each fold a promise. It wasn't just about the food. It wasn't just about the ranch or the men who ate her meals. It was about something deeper, something she had forgotten, something she was finally beginning to remember. The kitchen smelled different now. It smelled like more than just a meal. It smelled like the past, the present, and the future all coming together in a single moment. She had been given more than just a chance to cook. She had been given the chance to heal herself, and maybe even the others. She took a deep breath, letting the scent of the tamales fill the air, and felt a small spark of hope flicker deep inside her. And as the door creaked open again, she knew this time it wouldn't be Mateo or the men who would speak first. It would be the food, and it would speak louder than anything else. They weren't eating food. They were remembering something they'd lost. Esme stood in the cookhouse, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the room. The tamales were finished, wrapped carefully in corn husks, their aroma filling the space with the warm, familiar scent of home. She had never made them for anyone but herself before, but now they were here, placed in a steaming pot, ready to be served. She hadn't anticipated how much of herself would go into each fold, each pinch of masa, each spice mixed with memory. The door opened, and the men walked in one by one, just as they always did. The first was Raul, the foreman, his boots scraping against the floorboards, his hat pulled low over his brow. He didn't look at her, didn't greet her, but there was a shift in the air. A subtle change, a small movement, as if he too sensed something was different. Esme felt his gaze linger on the steaming pot, but he didn't speak. The others followed suit, filling the long table in silence. There was Thomas, the quiet, stable hand, always with his shoulders slumped, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on him. And then the older man, whose beard was streaked with gray, his face weathered and worn from years under the sun. He sat without a word, his movements slow and deliberate, like he had learned the value of each action over a lifetime. Esme stood quietly by the stove watching them. Her hands were still, the ladle resting in her grip. She knew they didn't need anything from her except the food, but there was something else. She was trying to offer something beyond the meal. She had hoped that in these moments they might see beyond the cook, see her as something more than just a woman with a skillet. The first plate was filled, and Raul was the first to take it. He didn't thank her, didn't nod in approval. He simply took his seat, ate his food, and waited. The others followed in silence. Esme stood back watching them eat. It wasn't like the last meal she'd served them. There was a quiet reverence in their movements now, a carefulness, as if the food had reached something deeper in them. It wasn't just beans and corn. It was something they had forgotten, something they had lost in the days of hard work, grief, and silent struggle. As she watched Thomas take his first bite, she saw his face soften just for a second. His eyes closed briefly, and when he opened them, there was something different, something unspoken. She saw it in the way the older man ate, too, his hand pausing mid-air, the spoon hovering as he chewed. It wasn't just the tamales. It was the way the food seemed to awaken something in them. And then there was Mateo. Esme didn't expect him to act any differently. He never did. But when he picked up his spoon and tasted the tamales, he froze. His shoulders tensed, the muscles in his jaw working as he chewed slowly, deliberately. It wasn't the reaction she had expected. She had thought he would dismiss it as he had so many things before. But this was different. He looked up at her, and for the first time, there was something in his eyes that wasn't judgment. It wasn't approval either. It was recognition. The room was still. The air was thick with unspoken words, and Esme couldn't move. She didn't know what to say, how to break the silence that had settled around them. But the quiet wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that wrapped itself around you, pressing against you, holding you in a way that made you feel seen even when no one spoke. The men continued eating, but now their movements were slower, more deliberate. Each spoonful, each bite seemed to carry more weight than it had before. Esme walked to the counter and began cleaning the dishes, her hands moving automatically, almost mechanically. But inside, something was shifting. She had done it. She had fed them. Not just with food, but with something more. She had offered them a piece of herself, and in return, they had given her something she hadn't known she was looking for. As the last man finished his plate, the room settled back into silence. Mateo stood and picked up his plate, walking over to the wash basin without a word. The others followed suit, stacking their plates, neatly returning their utensils to the counter. Esme stood still, watching them, her heart beating faster in her chest. Raul was the last to leave. He turned before he stepped out the door, his gaze meeting hers briefly. "Good," he said simply, his voice gruff but not unkind. And then he was gone. Esme exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping. She stood there for a long moment, her fingers still wrapped around the ladle, staring at the empty table. The meal was over. The men had eaten. But something had changed. The cookhouse was quieter now, filled with a different kind of silence. It wasn't oppressive. It wasn't heavy. It was respectful. She turned back to the stove, her mind racing, heart still pounding in her chest. She had done it. She had fed them. But more than that, she had fed herself. She had given them a part of her, and they had taken it without question, without hesitation. As she began to clean the last of the dishes, a small, unexpected smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. For the first time since coming to Sombra Valley, she felt a shift. A small one, but enough to be felt, enough to be real. And as she dried the last dish and placed it back on the shelf, she knew one thing for sure. She had a place here, not just in the kitchen, but in the silence that followed the meal, in the respect she had earned quietly with her food. The door opened again, and Esme looked up, expecting one of the men, maybe Mateo, but it was Bay standing in the doorway with a knowing look in her eyes. "You're doing good," Bea said softly, her voice warm but measured. "The men don't show it much, but you're doing good." Esme nodded, the weight of Bea's words settling over her like a blanket. "I think they're starting to see it," Esme replied quietly, her voice full of something she hadn't expected. Hope. Nothing grows unless someone believes the ground can change. The sky was different today. The clouds had shifted overnight, gathering in thick clusters that threatened rain but hadn't quite decided. The wind was light, almost teasing, swirling dust in little eddies around the yard, but the air was cool enough to make Esme stand at the stove a little longer than usual, savoring the silence of the cookhouse. It was early, just before dawn. She had gotten used to waking before the men getting the fire started the coffee brewing. She didn't mind. It was her time to gather her thoughts before the world awoke, before she was needed. It was quiet work, solitary work, and that solitude, once foreign and suffocating, had become something she learned to appreciate. She stirred the pot of beans on the stove, the smell of cumin and garlic mixing with the rich earthiness of the beans. It wasn't much, just beans and onions, but it felt right. Everything she made had purpose now. Even the simplest meal carried meaning. Esme glanced at the shelf where the tamales sat cooling in the corner. She'd made them again, just like her mother had taught her. It wasn't a feast, not by anyone's standards. But it was a meal, and here that was enough. The door creaked open behind her, and Esme didn't turn immediately. She could tell by the footsteps who it was. Mateo's steps were deliberate, slow but sure, like the earth had taught him to move with purpose. He didn't rush, didn't waste time. His presence filled the room without him needing to speak. "Something smells good," he said, his voice low but clear. Esme nodded, setting the ladle down and wiping her hands on her apron. "I've got beans and cornbread, and I made tamales." Mateo walked over to the counter, his gaze moving over the pots and bowls as if he were inspecting the meal, not just the food. He picked up the tamale, turning it in his hands, feeling the heat of it through the corn husk. He didn't say anything, just looked at it for a long moment. Esme watched him carefully, wondering what he thought. She had learned that his silence wasn't always critical, but it still made her nervous. It was the same silence she had grown up with, heavy, waiting, always expecting something more than words. After a long pause, Mateo sat at the table, placing the tamale in front of him, without a word. He picked up his fork and took a bite. The room was quiet, the only sound the scrape of the fork on the plate as Mateo ate slowly. His gaze remained fixed on the food, but it wasn't just the tamales he was tasting. Esme knew that. She had seen the way he looked at things, like he was trying to understand them, trying to peel back their layers. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than usual. "It's good." Esme felt a warmth spread through her chest at the simple praise. It wasn't much, but it was more than she had expected, more than she had hoped for. "Thank you," she said quietly, almost as if she hadn't expected him to say anything at all. Mateo looked up at her, his dark eyes steady. "You've been here a while now," he said, his voice thoughtful. "And you've proven yourself." Esme blinked, unsure of what he meant. She wasn't used to compliments. She wasn't used to this kind of recognition. She had always been the one who did the work without asking for anything in return. But with Mateo, it felt different. He wasn't just giving her praise for the meal. He was acknowledging her place here. The quiet power she had slowly begun to build, one meal at a time. "I'm not here for praise," she replied, her voice steady. "I'm here because I need to be, and because I can cook." Mateo smiled, then just a little, the corners of his mouth turning up slightly. It wasn't a grand gesture. It was small, subtle, but it was there. And in that moment, Esme knew something had changed. She wasn't just the cook anymore. She was something more. He set his fork down and looked at her. "You're not just a cook, Esme. You're part of this place now. You fed these men, fed them more than just food. You fed them something they didn't know they were missing." Esme's heart tightened in her chest. She didn't know what to say. She wasn't used to hearing those words, especially not from someone like Mateo. but she could feel the truth of it deep down. The men didn't just eat because they were hungry. They ate because they had to. But with her, with what she made, they came together, if only for a moment. They came together as something more than just men working the land. They came together as people. She swallowed hard, feeling the lump in her throat, but she didn't look away. "I just do what I can," she said softly. Mateo stood up and placed the empty plate on the counter, giving her a final look. "What you can is enough." And just like that, he was gone. Esme stood there, her hands still resting on the counter, the kitchen falling silent once more. But it wasn't the same silence. It was different. It was filled with something that hadn't been there before, something she couldn't name, but something she could feel in the pit of her stomach. She turned back to the stove, stirring the beans gently, her movements slow and deliberate. Her heart was still racing, and her mind was full of thoughts she couldn't quite sort through. But there was a part of her that felt lighter, a part of her that felt like she had finally found a place here, a place she could belong. She looked out the small window above the sink, watching as the wind pushed the clouds across the sky. The rain was coming, she could feel it in the air. The land would be soaked soon, the earth would take the water like it had been waiting for it. And maybe, just maybe, the land was beginning to understand her too. She wasn't just here to feed the men. She was here to stay, to build something real, something lasting. And this time it wasn't just about surviving. It was about thriving. Esme took a deep breath, exhaled slowly, and felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones. She could do this, and she would. As the rain began to fall softly against the roof, Esme stood there in the cookhouse, her heart finally at peace. She had a place now, and the world outside didn't seem so distant. "You ran into the fire," Mateo said, "when I could not." Esme stood at the stove, the fire crackling gently beneath the pot of beans, her hands moving as they always did, steady, automatic. But the silence in the cookhouse felt different now, heavier somehow, as if the air was thick with something unsaid. Mateo had just left, his words still lingering in the room like smoke. She hadn't expected him to say anything like that. She hadn't expected him to look at her like that, like she was more than just the cook, more than just the woman who kept the kitchen running. She had always been good at hiding the things that mattered most to her, the parts of herself that were still raw, still healing. She had learned to bury them deep, to focus on the work, on the food. But Mateo's words had cut through that wall, and for the first time she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: acknowledgement. Recognition. The door opened again, but this time it wasn't Mateo. It was Raul, his face grim as he stepped inside the cookhouse, his boots clunking softly on the floor. He glanced around, his eyes landing on Esme. "Something's happened," he said, his voice low and tense. Esme's heart skipped. She turned, wiping her hands on her apron. "What is it?" Raul didn't immediately answer. Instead, he took a deep breath and stepped further into the room, his gaze shifting to the pot of beans on the stove. For a moment, he didn't seem like himself. His usual gruff demeanor was gone, replaced with something unreadable. "Mateo's gone out," he finally said, his voice tight. "There's been some trouble with the cattle. Some of the herd broke through the east fence. We need all hands." Esme's pulse quickened. "Where is he now?" "Out by the fence line," Raul replied, his eyes narrowing. "He's been at it for hours. It's dangerous out there, especially with the rain coming in. And you know how Mateo is. He doesn't stop until it's done." Esme's mind raced, her heart beating faster with every word. Mateo out in the rain alone, pushing himself too hard. She could feel the tension in the air, the same kind of tension that had settled in her chest when he had looked at her just moments before, when he had spoken the words that had taken root in her heart. He had been vulnerable even if only for a moment, and now he was out there alone, in danger. She couldn't ignore it. Not this time. She grabbed her coat and hurried to the door, stopping only to glance back at Raoul. "I'm going after him." Raoul stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Esme, you don't." But she was already out the door, the wind biting at her face as she rushed toward the barn. She didn't stop to listen to Raoul's warnings. She didn't stop for anything. The need to find Mateo, to make sure he was all right, pushed her forward, her boots splashing through the wet ground, the dark sky pressing down on her shoulders like a weight. She found him near the east fence line, just as Raoul had said. Mateo was on horseback, his hat low against the wind, his eyes focused on the cattle that had broken through the fence. The herd was restless, moving in tight clusters as the storm began to gather in the distance. The sound of hooves against the earth mixed with the howling wind, the rain starting to fall in soft, cold droplets. Esme's breath caught when she saw him there, so far out alone, working through the storm as if it was just another day, just another task to complete. But she knew better. She knew that he was pushing himself too hard, the same way he had always done, always buried under the weight of his responsibilities, never asking for help. "Mateo," she called out, her voice carrying over the wind. He didn't look up immediately, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his body held the reins, as if he had to keep the world under control even when it was slipping away. "Mateo!" she shouted again, urgency rising in her chest. This time he turned. His eyes caught hers, and for a moment neither of them moved. The world around them seemed to pause, as if everything timed the storm, the cattle had all come to a halt. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, like the moment before a storm broke. "Esme," he said finally, his voice hoarse, his face drawn. "What are you doing out here? I could ask you the same thing," she replied, her voice sharp. "You're pushing yourself too hard." "I'm fine," he said, but there was no conviction in his words. The lie was thin, barely held together. Esme stepped forward, reaching for the reins of his horse. "No, you're not. You need to come back. The cattle will be fine." He didn't answer at first, his jaw clenched tight, but the storm was growing stronger. The wind picked up the rain, falling harder now, cold and unforgiving. Esme could feel it the way it chilled her bones, but it didn't seem to faze Mateo. He wasn't worried about the rain. He wasn't worried about anything. But she was. She stepped closer, her hand still on the reins, and this time when she looked at him, she saw it, the cracks in his armor, the way he was holding himself together, like it was the only thing he could do. The way he had always held everything inside. "I'm not leaving you out here," she said, her voice softer now. "You don't have to do this alone." There was a long pause, and then Mateo finally exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. He glanced at her, his eyes darker than the storm that raged above them. "You're not afraid of me, are you?" he asked, his voice quiet, almost too quiet for her to hear. Esme looked at him, the weight of his words sinking in. She had seen him as a man who could carry the world, a man who never needed anyone. But the truth was that she had always seen through him. She had always known that the toughness, the stoicism wasn't a shield, it was a prison. "No," she said softly, her hand still on the reins. "I'm not afraid of you." And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a declaration or a confession. It was just the understanding that for the first time they weren't alone. They didn't have to be. Mateo looked at her, his face softening just the slightest bit before he finally nodded his hand, releasing the reins. "All right," he muttered. "Let's get out of here." Esme guided the horse back toward the ranch, the rain now pouring down in sheets, soaking them both to the bone. But the storm didn't matter anymore. They were together in it, walking through it side by side, and that she realized was the first step. Nothing grows unless someone believes the ground can change. Esme leaned against the counter, her hands still from the work she'd been doing. The sun had finally set, casting the ranch in a wash of deep purple and gold, the horizon blurring into night. The kitchen was quiet now. The sound of the wind outside was distant, and the men had finished eating, leaving only the empty plates and the still warm stove behind. She wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric rough against her skin. Her heart still beat fast from the meal she had prepared, from the moments of silence that had stretched between the men as they ate. There had been no words, no thanks. But there was something else. The way they had looked at the food, the way they had savored it, like they had been starved, not just for nourishment, but for something deeper, something they couldn't name. She had done more than feed them, and somehow she had done more than just make her place here. She had shown them something they hadn't known they needed, a small act of care, a small act of belief. As she washed the dishes, her mind drifted. The kitchen had become her refuge, her space. It was the one place where she knew she belonged. And yet, as much as she had poured herself into every meal, into every dish, into every bite they had taken, she knew that it wasn't enough. There was more to be done. There was more to be built. The ranch hadn't changed. Not yet. It was still the same harsh place it had always been, demanding, unforgiving cold. But Esme had begun to believe, even if only a little, that change was possible, that she could be part of it. She could help build something new here, something that wasn't just about surviving, something that was about living. Her fingers trembled slightly as she dried the last plate and set it on the shelf. The kitchen, still warm from the fire, seemed to pulse with possibility. The food had filled the men's bellies, but more than that, it had filled the space between them. It had brought them together, if only for a moment. She paused and looked out the small window, her gaze drawn to the horizon. The sky had gone dark, the stars just beginning to prick through the night, a soft shimmer against the blackness. The wind had picked up again, rustling the leaves of the trees outside, and Esme could feel the shift in the air. The earth was waiting for something, as though it was holding its breath. She was waiting too. There was no sound, no words, just the quiet hum of the world around her. She knew what had to come next. It wasn't enough to just feed the men. It wasn't enough to keep the kitchen running. She had to do more than that. She had to push, had to make a stand, even if it was small, even if it felt like it might break her. The door opened with a soft creak, and Esme turned, surprised to see Tomas standing in the doorway. His face was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes that made her pause. He wasn't just here for food. He wasn't just here for the usual. "Can we talk?" His voice was quiet, almost hesitant, but there was a determination behind it that made her heart skip. Esme nodded, her breath caught in her throat. She hadn't expected him to come to her like this, not like this. They had spoken only in passing, exchanged small words about the food, about the kitchen. But now it was different. Something in the air had shifted. Something had changed between them. And she didn't know if it was a good change or a dangerous one. He stepped into the room, and the door closed behind him with a soft thud, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet. "Sit down," she said, her voice steady even though her pulse was still racing. "I've got plenty of work to finish, but I'll listen." Tomas glanced at the stove and the empty plates on the counter, then back at her. "I don't know how to say this," he said, his voice almost a whisper. "But I've been thinking about what you've been doing here, what you've been cooking." Esme furrowed her brow, unsure of where he was going with this. "You've been eating it, haven't you?" she said, trying to lighten the mood, but her smile felt thin. The food's not bad, is it? Tomas shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips, but his eyes remained serious. No, it's not that. It's more. What you're doing here, it's not just cooking. You're changing things. I've been watching the men. They don't know it yet, but they're changing because of you. Esme blinked, the weight of his words sinking into her chest like stones. I don't understand, she said quietly, her voice unsure. How could I possibly change anything here? I'm just cooking. I'm just trying to make it through the day. Tomas took a step closer, his hand resting lightly on the back of the chair in front of her. It's not just about the food. It's about what the food represents. The way you've come here and you've given us something to hold on to, something we forgot we even needed. That's more than cooking. You're healing something we've been missing for a long time. Esme swallowed, her chest tight with emotion. She hadn't realized how much she had poured into this place. She hadn't realized that the men were looking to her for more than just sustenance. She had become part of something, part of a larger world that was bigger than the kitchen, bigger than the meals she made. Tomas hesitated for a moment, as if he was choosing his words carefully. I know Mateo doesn't show it, but he sees what you've been doing. We all see it. We're not used to this. Not used to someone putting something into this place like you have. You've given us something we didn't know we were missing. Esme opened her mouth to respond, but the words didn't come. She didn't know what to say. The flood of emotions she had been holding back threatened to break free, and she was afraid that if she spoke, she might not be able to stop them. Tomas reached out and touched her arm lightly, his gaze soft. I just wanted you to know. You're making a difference here. More than you know. She looked up at him, then her throat tight with something she couldn't explain. She didn't know how to respond, but for the first time since she had arrived at the ranch, she felt like she had been seen. Truly seen. Thank you. She whispered the words, a quiet admission, a small surrender. Tomas smiled, the warmth in his eyes making her chest tighten. No. Thank you. The room seemed to grow quieter, then the weight of his words hanging between them like something fragile. Esme didn't know what would happen next, didn't know where this moment would take them. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like she was finally on the right path, and that, she realized, was enough for now. As Tomas turned to leave, he paused at the door, his back still to her. We'll be okay, he said softly. We just needed someone to remind us that we could be. Esme didn't respond, but as she watched him disappear into the darkness of the ranch, she knew he was right. They would be okay. She would make sure of it. The door opened with a soft creak, the wind from outside bringing in the scent of rain and dust. Esme didn't look up at first. She had been working in the cookhouse for hours, her hands moving without thought as they always did. But when the footsteps stopped just inside the door, the stillness in the room made her glance up. Mateo stood there, his broad shoulders outlined against the dim light outside his figure, almost a shadow against the doorframe. He didn't speak right away. He never did. His silence was as familiar as the rhythm of the men coming in for their meals, but tonight there was something different. There was a weight in the air, something that wasn't there before. Esme wiped her hands on her apron and set the spoon down. The stew was done thick and rich with the flavor of cumin and chili, just the way the men liked it. The cornbread was cooling on the counter, the smell filling the space between them like an invitation. Are you hungry? Esme asked quietly, her voice steady but unsure. She had learned to make herself invisible here, to be part of the background, to be the cook, the helper, the one who kept the ranch moving in its own quiet way. But tonight it felt like the ground was shifting beneath her feet. Mateo didn't answer immediately. He just stood there, his eyes fixed on her. The silence stretched between them, thick and heavy, like a breath held too long. Finally, he stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, the sound almost too final. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low but clear, "about what's been happening here." Esme's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She had thought that maybe after everything, after the tamales, after the meals, after the quiet moments that had passed between them, she had earned some kind of understanding. But now, standing in the dim light of the cookhouse, the weight of Mateo's words felt like something more. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mateo didn't sit down. He stood across from her, his hands resting on the back of a chair. He seemed to be measuring the words before he spoke them, as though each one was heavy with meaning. "This ranch, it's been a place of survival for a long time. The land's unforgiving, the work never ends. But the men, us, they've been carrying something for too long. We've all been carrying it." Esme looked at him, unsure of where this was going, but she felt the weight of his words. The ranch had always been about survival. That was what she had come to understand. It wasn't just the land that was unforgiving. It was the men too, their hardened hearts, their silence. She had tried to break through that silence, tried to offer something more than just food, but she hadn't realized how deep the weight went. "I've seen it in the way they eat," Mateo continued, his voice low. "How they've begun to trust again. Not just because of the food, but because of you. What you've done here, it's more than just cooking. It's more than just meals. You've given them something they forgot they needed. You've reminded them that they're human." Esme felt a tightness in her chest, her breath catching in her throat. She hadn't realized it was happening. She hadn't thought that the food she cooked, simple meals made with care, could mean more than just feeding the men. But it had. It had broken something in them, something that had been shut off for years. They had started to remember what it meant to be more than just survivors. They were beginning to live again. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She didn't know if she could handle hearing this, if she could accept that what she had done mattered, that she mattered. Mateo's gaze softened just for a moment, before he looked away. "Because it's not just about the men anymore. It's about you. You've earned a place here, Esme, not just as the cook. You've earned a place in this family whether you realize it or not." Esme's heart raced, the words hitting her like a wave. She had come to the ranch with nothing but the clothes on her back and a hope that she could make it through the days. She hadn't expected anything beyond that. But now, with Mateo's words hanging in the air between them, she felt something shift inside her. Something that had been buried, hidden under years of silence, of survival, of simply getting by. She swallowed hard, trying to keep her emotions in check. "I don't know what to do with that," she whispered. Mateo stepped closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "You don't have to do anything. Just keep being who you are. You've already done enough." Esme shook her head, her breath shaky. "But I'm not part of this. I don't belong here. I'm just the cook, the woman who feeds the men." Mateo's expression softened, and for a moment there was a vulnerability in his eyes that she hadn't seen before. "That's the thing, Esme. You're not just the cook. You're the one who brought us back to life. You're the one who showed us that there's more than just surviving, that there's something worth living for." His words hung in the air, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. The weight of the moment was almost too much to bear. Esme could feel the pull of it, the realization that this place, these people, wasn't just where she had ended up. It was where she belonged. And then, just as quietly as he had come in, Mateo turned and walked toward the door, his boots heavy on the floor. But before he left, he paused, looking over his shoulder at her. "You've earned your place here, Esme. Don't ever forget that." Esme stood there for a long time, staring at the door he had just closed behind him. She could feel the weight of his words, like an anchor sinking deep inside her. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. And for the first time since she had arrived, she believed it. The storm outside had started again, the wind howling against the walls of the cookhouse, but inside it was warm. And for the first time, Esme knew that she was part of something real. Something that wasn't just about food or work or survival. It was about belonging. And it was hers if she was brave enough to take it. "I'll fight for what's mine," Esme whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and clean. The ranch had settled into its familiar rhythm again, the men working the land, and the horses, the sounds of hooves and voices rising with the sun. But Esme felt a shift inside herself, a quiet determination that had settled into her chest. The realization that she wasn't just here to cook, to feed, to pass time. She was here to claim something, to fight for it, and to make it hers. The cookhouse was warm, the fire crackling gently in the stove as she worked through the familiar motions of preparing a meal. The scent of frying onions and cumin filled the space, grounding her in the simplicity of the work. She had come to rely on the rhythm of it, the steady hum of the kitchen, the way it gave her a sense of purpose. It was in these small acts, stirring the pot, adding the salt, chopping the vegetables, that she felt in control of something, that she belonged. The door creaked open behind her, and she turned to see Raúl standing in the doorway, his posture stiff, his face unreadable. "Esme," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Her heart skipped and she wiped her hands on her apron, her mind racing. Had something happened? Was it about the food, about her place here? Raúl stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a quiet click. He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "There's been talk. About you. About what you've done here." Esme's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know how to respond. Had she crossed a line? Had she done something that would make them want her gone? "Don't worry." Raúl continued, his voice softening. "It's not bad talk. It's more of a reckoning, I guess. Mateo's been talking to the men." Esme's stomach tightened. Mateo. His words had been lingering in her mind ever since he had left the cookhouse days ago. Those quiet promises he had made, the way he had looked at her. She had told herself that it didn't matter that she wasn't here for him, that she was here for the work. But now with Raúl standing in front of her, there was a gnawing feeling in her chest that she couldn't ignore. "They're asking about you." Raúl said, his eyes meeting hers. "About what you want. About what you're really here for." Esme opened her mouth to speak, but the words didn't come. She had been so focused on just surviving, on keeping her head down and doing the work. But now that the men were asking, now that Mateo was asking, she realized she had never asked herself what she truly wanted. She had never thought beyond the simple act of feeding them. "I don't know what I'm here for," Esme admitted softly, her gaze dropping to the floor. I just wanted to cook, to make a place for myself." Raúl nodded, his expression softening. "You've done that. More than you know." He paused, letting his words settle in the space between them. "But there's something else. Something Mateo wants to offer you." Esme's head snapped up, confusion furrowing her brow. "What do you mean?" Raúl hesitated for a moment before continuing. "He's asked for you to stay, to be part of the ranch, for good." Esme blinked, her mind racing. Stay, I don't understand. Raoul took a step closer, his voice lowering. You've become more than just a cook here, Esme. You've become part of something bigger. Mateo sees that. He sees what you've done, what you've given to this place. Esme's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just about food. It wasn't just about the men. It was about her place here. About the family she had never known she could have. Raoul's gaze softened, and he placed a hand on her shoulder. He wants you to be part of this. Not just for your cooking, but for who you are, the heart of this place. The one who's been holding it together even when no one asked. Esme felt a knot tighten in her chest, the weight of his words pressing down on her. She had come here with nothing, with no expectations. But now she was being offered something she hadn't even realized. She wanted something that went beyond survival. Something that could change everything. I don't know if I'm ready for that, she whispered, her voice breaking as the uncertainty flooded back. I don't know if I can be what they need. Raoul gave her a small, understanding smile. It's not about being perfect, Esme. It's about being real, being part of something. And you've already done that, whether you realize it or not. Esme stood still for a moment, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She didn't know what the future would hold, didn't know if she was ready for what Mateo was offering her. But she knew this, she couldn't run from it anymore. She couldn't hide in the kitchen cooking meals to make up for something she didn't understand. She had to take the step. She had to believe in it. Thank you, Esme said quietly, her voice shaking with emotion. I'll think about it. Raoul nodded, turning toward the door. You don't have to decide now. But know this, you're part of this place, Esme. And that's something no one can take away from you. As the door closed behind him, Esme stood in the quiet of the cookhouse, her heart pounding in her chest. The weight of Raoul's words lingered, but it wasn't fear that gripped her now. It was something else, something she couldn't name. The realization that she had a place here, that she had earned it. She looked at the stove, the fire still crackling softly beneath the pot of beans. The kitchen was warm, familiar, and for the first time in a long time, Esme didn't feel alone. She didn't feel like an outsider. She felt like she belonged. And that, she realized, was the first step. The educational lesson learned from this story is that resilience isn't always about surviving hardship alone. It's about opening ourselves to healing through community, purpose, and trust. Even in later chapters of life, it's never too late to rediscover a sense of belonging, or to build something new from what feels broken. As Esme found her place in the ranch, not through force, but through quiet, steady commitment, we too can find meaning by showing up, fully embracing change, and allowing others to see the value we carry. Life's most unexpected turns often reveal where we were meant to be all along.